Hello everyone, I'm Chris, and this is everything you need to know before watching Venom: The Last Dance, releasing October 25th. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. To begin, we're taken into outer space as a spacecraft sent by a genetics corporation called the Life Foundation looks to transport unidentified specimens back to Earth, until suddenly, the ship begins to plummet rapidly and eventually crashes into East Malaysia, where they still eventually manage to retrieve 3 of their 4 samples from the wreckage and transfer them to the research facility in San Francisco, while the 4th appears to have escaped. Also in San Francisco, we meet Eddie Brock, an investigative reporter for MNBN and host of the Eddie Brock Report, on which his boss Jack has asked him to interview the founder and CEO of the Life Foundation, Carlton Drake, so the latter can assure the people that they're safe despite the recent spacecraft crash. Eddie, though, believes Drake's a crook, and so is reluctant to take the job, but Jack ultimately convinces him to do it. Later that night, we also meet Eddie's wife, Annie Wang, and learn that she actually works as an attorney for a firm that works for the Life Foundation, giving her access to some of the company's concealed information that Eddie decides to take a peek at after she's fallen asleep. And in one of the documents, he discovers that the Life Foundation have run a number of experiments that have resulted in their test subjects being killed. So Eddie decides to question Drake about his unlawful experiments during their interview. But this just cuts the interview short, and subsequently results in both Eddie and Anne being fired from their jobs, which in turn causes Anne to break up with him. Over the next 6 months, Eddie struggles to find anyone who will hire him, and so he spends most of his days drinking and miserable. That is until he's one day approached by a scientist for the Life Foundation, Dr. Dora Skirth, who reveals that everything Eddie accused Drake of was true, and that things have only begun to get worse, as he's now started testing the unidentified specimens transported to Earth months back on less fortunate humans in an attempt to achieve symbiosis between the 2 species, but it's just been resulting in death after death. So Eddie, although refusing to help her initially, since he'd already had his life destroyed by Drake once before, eventually agrees to do so, with Skirth sneaking him into their research facility and laboratory, in which he comes across a friend of his and someone we'd actually met earlier named Maria, a homeless woman who he'd frequently pass by on his way to his local convenience store. And so, upon recognizing her, Eddie attempts to free her from her pod. Although, when he does this, she then suddenly attacks him and is revealed to be carrying one of the symbiotes as it transfers itself onto Eddie, while Maria falls to the floor dead. Eddie's then soon chased by the building's security due to him having set off the security breach alarm, but he impressively manages to escape them and make it back to his apartment. Although once home, he begins to have strange symptoms. Despite believing he may have been infected by something at the lab, Eddie still decides to go off and track down Anne to tell her about what he saw, since she's the only person he can trust, and since Dr. Skirth hasn't responded to any of his calls. But he just ends up completely ruining Anne and her new boyfriend Dan's dinner with his incredibly odd behavior, which prompts them to take him to the hospital, where Dan also happens to work as a surgeon. Meanwhile, back at the Life Foundation, Drake learns that it was Eddie who'd snuck into their lab with Dr. Skirth's help, so he uses Skirth as his next test subject, whilst his men are sent to Eddie's apartment to retrieve the symbiote he'd escaped with. But upon arriving at the apartment and confronting Eddie, the symbiote suddenly unleashes an attack against them, which eventually spills out of the building, forcing Eddie to hop on his motorcycle, as they continue to chase after him before ultimately being struck by one of their vehicles, leaving him severely injured. But his wounds quickly heal thanks to the symbiote, who emerges in its true form, suddenly bites one of their heads off and flees the scene. Once having escaped, the symbiote formally introduces himself to Eddie as Venom, and informs him that, from here on out, he will serve as his ride here on Earth, and will do as he says. Venom's first command is for Eddie to bring him to one of Drake's rockets, but before they do that, Venom first allows Eddie to make a quick stop at his old place of work, so that Eddie can leave the evidence he'd collected from within the Life Foundation's laboratory for his former boss in hopes he releases it to the public. However, moments after dropping off this information, he's suddenly surrounded by an entire SWAT team, so Eddie's forced to allow Venom to take each of them out, which also nearly results in Venom eating one of them. But he's interrupted by the arrival of Anne, who had managed to track Eddie down after hearing of the attack, and promptly brings him back to the hospital. There, Dan informs Eddie that the symbiote has actually begun to slowly eat away at his internal organs, which will eventually kill him. And this revelation prompts Venom to begin strangling Dan until his attack is stopped by Anne unleashing a high-pitched sound, which were shown to weaken the symbiote previously. and which ends up forcing Venom to detach himself from Eddie and flee, while Eddie also decides to leave shortly thereafter, fed up with all that he's been put through. Speaking of escaped symbiotes, back at the Life Foundation's research facility, Carlton Drake is met by none other than the symbiote that had escaped when they were first brought down to Earth, which then transfers itself from a little girl onto Drake and reveals its name to be Riot. Drake's not frightened by having to share his body with the symbiote as Eddie was though, and the two actually agree to work together and transport millions more of Riot's species to Earth, with Drake seeking to transform the human race into superior beings, while Riot just plans on taking over their world. In addition to Drake having formed a partnership with Riot, he also soon captures Eddie, who upon learning he and Venom are no longer attached to one another, Drake has his men take out into the woods to be killed. But fortunately for Eddie, he's saved by Venom's arrival, who'd managed to bond with Anne shortly after Eddie's exit, and who promptly kills each of Drake's goons before transferring himself back to Eddie with a kiss. Once reattached, Venom apologizes for lying to Eddie, and reveals that he's actually grown a liking to him, which has convinced him not to take over Earth, as he'd rather just hang out together here. In order to prevent Earth's demise though, they'll first need to take out Riot and prevent him from bringing any more of their kind back to the planet. So the two head over to the Life Foundation just as Riot and Drake launch one of their rockets, as well as kill all of Drake's employees. And ultimately, after a back and forth battle, Venom and Eddie manage to get the better of Riot and Drake, with Venom damaging the Life Foundation probe to create a huge explosion that kills them both, and appears to also kill Venom as well. But fortunately, he manages to survive, and so continues to be bonded with Eddie. Although, in order for this to work without Venom having to eat away at Eddie's insides, he'll need to consistently be fed brains or chocolate, since they're the only two things on Earth with the ingredient he needs to survive. So Eddie primarily feeds him chicken brains, along with the occasional bad guy. Sometime following all of this, Eddie receives an opportunity to get back to being a renowned reporter. As an inmate at San Quentin prison, serial killer Cletus Cassidy asks specifically to be interviewed by Eddie, after refusing to speak to anyone else throughout his imprisonment. And upon meeting one another, Cassidy explains that he's aware of Eddie's current diminished status as a reporter, and so believes this to be a great opportunity for them to help one another, with him offering to give him the scoop on his life story in return for Eddie getting his message out there, and Eddie ultimately agrees, recording Cletus's message that reads, "The distant cathedral is all I see, fractured angel, the other part of me." Just before exiting though, Eddie takes a peek into Cletus's cell, in which he sees a bunch of symbols carved onto the walls, that once back home, Venom helps him decipher, leading them to uncovering the location of the bodies of Cassidy's victims. So Eddie publishes this discovery, as well as Cletus's message, in the Daily Bugle newspaper, which subsequently results in the governor of California overturning his moratorium and reinstating the death penalty for Cassidy, while Eddie's able to regain his credibility. A few days before Cletus's sentence is dealt out, Eddie receives a letter from Cassidy inviting him to meet one last time ahead of his execution. So Eddie does, giving Cletus the chance to wish him the worst this world can offer, and that he remain alone forever, as he considers Eddie a cancer to everyone who's ever loved him. A claim that suddenly prompts Venom to unleash an attack against him. But this just inadvertently allows Cletus the chance to take a bite out of Eddie's hand and taste some of his blood, which he notices isn't like any blood he's tasted before. Eddie's furious with Venom's actions and voices his frustration once back at their apartment, expressing desire to live his life without Venom complaining about or interfering with everything. To which Venom responds by headbutting Eddie, prompting the latter to retaliate with a strike of his own that results in him being flung around his apartment until Eddie eventually manages to turn on the fire alarm that unleashes a high-pitched noise, prompting Venom to flee the apartment and bond with someone else. Shifting focus back to Cletus Cassidy now, as he's prepared for his execution via lethal injection. However, the injection is somehow blocked, and Cletus's body begins to transform as a result of his, Eddie, and Venom's blood combining to form a symbiote called Carnage, which breaks them out of his pod and unleashes an attack on those in attendance as they make their escape. Following their escape, Cletus next turns their focus to the Ravencroft Institute, in search of the fractured angel he'd sent out his message for earlier, Francis Barrison. Cletus and Francis had first met when they were both children in the St. Estes Reform School, to which he'd been sent after killing his mother and grandmother. and she'd been sent to monitor her mutation, which allows her to unleash a sonic shriek. But in 1996, as her mutations continued to advance, she was prepared to be sent somewhere else where there were others like her, which greatly upset Cletus, but he was left unable to help as she was soon dragged out of her room by several guards, prompting her to let out a shriek in an attempt to escape that left a young cop named Patrick Mulligan deaf in one ear, and in turn resulted in him pulling out his gun and firing a shot to her eye, preventing her from causing any more damage as she was then taken to Ravencroft. Now a free man though, and with a powerful symbiote at his disposal, Cletus is able to break into the institution and free Francis after a violent attack, bringing the two together for the first time in over 2 decades. It doesn't take long for Cletus's escape to hit the news, from which Eddie soon learns of it before being met at his apartment by the aforementioned Patrick Mulligan, who's now a detective and had actually helped set up Eddie's meeting with Cletus earlier, but has now grown suspicious of Eddie, especially after all he was involved in within the last year or so, and believes he may have played a part in aiding Cletus in his escape. So he has Eddie brought into the station, and there questions him about how Cletus was able to break free from his execution, as well as break Francis out of Ravencroft. And Eddie begins to realize that this may all be the result of the bite Cletus took out of him earlier. So he calls up Anne and convinces her to meet him at the station so he can fill her in on all that's happened, and request her help in finding Venom, which she agrees to do. Venom, throughout all this, had been taking full advantage of no longer having to follow all of Eddie's strict rules, hopping from person to person, and even attending a nightclub. But although he no longer has Eddie forcing him not to go around eating people, he actually still chooses not to since he knows it would be wrong, leaving him incredibly hungry and having to drag himself over to the local convenience store, where he begs the store's owner, Miss Chen, who we've actually met before and is one of the few people who Eddie's told of Venom's existence, for some chocolate. And so she feeds him and allows him to bond with her for now. Luckily for Eddie, he'd assumed this is where Venom would have ended up, and so sent Anne there to find him. And although refusing to come to help Eddie at first, he ultimately agrees after some flirting from Anne. After quickly managing to break Eddie out of police custody, Venom forces him to apologize multiple times before the two can head off and intercept Cletus, Francis, and Carnage, who throughout this have been preparing for their wedding ceremony, which they hope to cap off with the deaths of Eddie, Venom, and Detective Mulligan. So after capturing Mulligan, the trio then capture Anne and leave Dan to deliver Eddie their ultimatum, offering to spare her life for his. Upon receiving their message, Eddie and Venom meet the trio in the midst of their ceremony and promptly enter a huge battle against them, which opens with Francis letting out a huge shriek directed at Venom. However, the sound also ends up damaging Carnage, prompting the symbiote to send her flying with a strike and order her to shut her mouth, before turning his focus back to Venom and engaging in an incredible fight sequence against him. Meanwhile, Francis decides to turn her attention over to Mulligan, and after stabbing him in the back, she begins attempting to tear his eye out, while Carnage continues his brawl with Venom and eventually beats him badly enough that he reverts back into Eddie. With Eddie at their mercy, Cletus and Carnage prepare to make him watch as they kill Anne. At least that's until they're interrupted by Francis, who claims this is too much, so Carnage snatches her up as well, frightening Cletus, who begs the symbiote not to hurt her. And this dysfunction between the three of them ends up opening the door for Venom and Eddie to free Anne, with Venom sending a spike straight through Carnage's head that causes them to release their grip on her, and allows the heroes to bring her down to safety. Still though, Carnage is able to once again regain the upper hand after landing multiple stabs into Venom's body, but just when it appears the former may kill the latter, Venom suddenly whacks Francis off the top of the building, resulting in her letting out a shriek that sends the rest of them falling to the ground as well. But while Eddie and Venom are able to attach to one another before hitting the ground, thanks to help from Dan and Anne, Cletus and Carnage end up landing completely separated, while Francis crashes to the ground as well and is subsequently crushed by the cathedral's bell. And with both Cletus and Carnage greatly weakened, Venom's able to easily bring them to a definitive end by eating the symbiote whole and biting off Cletus's head. Immediately following their victory, Venom and Eddie are forced to go on the run as police helicopters arrive. So after saying their goodbyes to Anne and Dan, they flee to and hide out on a tropical beach for now, but remain ready to journey again if a protector is ever needed. Strangely, one day though, while chilling at their hotel watching TV, the two appear to be suddenly and inexplicably transported elsewhere, and it's soon revealed to actually have been to another dimension, as on the TV, an alternately Daily Bugle's news broadcast from reporter J. Jonah Jameson reveals the identity of New York's friendly neighborhood superhero Spider-Man to actually be a kid named Peter Parker. Confused, Eddie takes them to a nearby bar, and through the bartender, learns all about this alternate Earth and of all the superheroes and villains they've seen come and go, before soon enough, the two are transported back to their reality just as suddenly. Although unbeknownst to either of them, we see that a small part of the Venom symbiote has been inadvertently left behind. And that was everything you needed to know before Venom the Last Dance. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful in any way, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also let us know in the comments below where you hope to see Sony's Spider-Man Universe go next. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.